The Hunter Estuary, as any river fans out there will have guessed, is at the mouth of the Hunter River, which is just north of the city of Newcastle. The Hunter River flows through the Hunter Valley region, which is probably more famous for producing some of Australia's best wines. I myself went there on a little wine tasting in 2009. But let me tell you, I much prefer the heady bouquet of a mangrove swamp to a Merlot Blanc.
So I find myself in Newcastle, not England, can you tell? Does Newcastle, England have these beautiful wetlands? But we're quite near a very busy road. They like quite busy roads in Australia.
Newcastle, or Newy as the locals call it, is the second largest urban area in New South Wales, and I found it an interesting place, a mix of bougie beachfronts and industrial dystopia. It is still just about the largest coal port in the entire world. But I'm not here to talk about Newy. I'm here to visit some prime natural real estate just up the road.
So this is the Hunter Wetlands National Park. It's a patch of, well, they're wetlands. They're outside the city of Newcastle, so I've got the bus, about a half-hour bus ride up here.
These aren't just any wetlands though. These are Ramsar wetlands. And what indeed are Ramsar wetlands? Well, the UN decided that wetlands needed more protection. And so, as the UN likes to do, they had a convention on wetlands, which took place in a city called Ramsar in Iran. 90% of United Nations members have now signed up to the Convention on Wetlands. And when they join, they need to designate at least one wetland of international importance. There are now over 2,400 of these Ramsar sites across the world, covering an area larger than Mexico. Australia has 67, one of which is the Hunter Estuary. Now, I would never favour one habitat over another, but wetlands are my favourite. Is it land? Is it water? Is that rancid muddy smell even natural? The term wetlands covers a whole range of different habitats. A swamp is a wetland. A marsh is a wetland. A bog is a wetland. A wetland can be covered in woodland. It can be covered in moss. It can be next to the sea. It can be right the way up a mountain. The most important thing is wetlands are wet, at least some of the time. Wetlands are some of the most important habitats on Earth. The biodiversity in these places is off the charts, and they can control flooding. They capture carbon from the atmosphere. They provide humans with food and fresh water. February the 2nd, get it in your diary, World Wetlands Day.
It's about 5 o'clock, just gone 5 o'clock in the evening, so the sun is going to set. I think sunset's about 7:40, so the light's going to go down and it's going to get longer and shadowier, but the birds should be good.
There are in fact about 200 species of birds that either live in or pass through this area of wetlands. My first sighting was a very welcome one, because it was a welcome swallow. These swallows look very much like the barn swallows we know from Europe. In fact, the barn swallows are in Australia as well. And the welcome swallows, they love wetlands because they are full of flying insects, which they eat on the wing, and they use little bristles on the side of their beaks to guide the insects into their mouths. Nom nom nom.
I've just seen a flock of galahs, my first galahs, so that was very exciting. They're like pink and shouty. So yeah, let's see what we can see.
My entrance to the Hunter Wetlands was over a concrete road bridge, the Ash Island Bridge, which was over a wide river channel flanked by mangrove forest. Now, I was expecting to see a few more birds straight away, particularly wading birds, curlews, oyster catchers, plovers, those kinds of things. But fear not, the waterbird game did pick up eventually. As this was just an evening excursion, I didn't have much time to explore the wetlands to any great extent, so I picked a 6-kilometre loop around something called Ash Island. Ash Island, an interesting choice. Another example of Europeans giving the incorrect name to something in Australia. But who can blame them? It's not like there were loads of people there already who had already done the job of naming everything for them. Actually, these powdered wigged wanderers did sometimes get so flummoxed by the bizarre nature they found in Australia that they had to rely on the local words for things. The most famous example being gungaroo, which is the indigenous word for kangaroo. There were plenty of examples where they were just happy to go with the names they knew from back home. Australian magpies. Yes, from Australia. No, not a magpie. Flying foxes. Yes, they can fly, but they are not foxes. And fairy wrens. Neither a fairy nor a wren. Thankfully, people have largely dropped the word bear from koala. Which brings us on to the ash trees of Ash Island, Eleocarpus obavatus. Not only is this plant not in the same family as European ash trees, it's not even in the same order. The local indigenous name for the tree is chirine. Today it goes by several other names, my favourite being hard quandong. But this white timber was tough and hard and light and easy to work with and good for oars and boats and stuff like that. So the Europeans looked at it and they called it ash. Also, it produces a fruit that is known as an Australian wild peach. I don't need to tell you that this is not a real peach. And here's a predictable twist. Even though there used to be enough of these ash trees to name an entire island after them, so many had been cut down by the 1950s that they had almost disappeared from the New South Wales coast. In fact, this tree is one of only 8 original trees still standing on Ash Island, hence the useful information sign. A more surprising twist is that due to land reclamation in the 1960s, Ash Island isn't even its own island anymore. And so, in this hugely changed environment, just down the road from a globally important port city, it's not surprising that some of the plants here are not completely authentic. Actually, it's quite fitting for an internationally important wetland that there are a veritable United Nations of plant species here. Feniculum vulgare, or fennel, which is a well-known and tasty member of the carrot family that is found all around the Mediterranean, but also nowadays all across the world. Verbena brasiliensis, or Brazilian vervain, which is from, you've guessed it, Brazil. But it's very popular with gardeners and has escaped all over the world. And another pretty Latin American, Canna indica, also known as Indian shot. The mile-a-minute vine, or Ipomea cairica. Cairica means from Cairo, but this is now an invasive species all along the New South Wales coast. And the spear thistle, Socium vulgare, the bonnet national emblem of Scotland. I can get away with that accent, right? Because, like, my surname is a bit Scottish. But lots of Australian natives were thriving here too. The reed beds, for example, which are one of my favourite features of any wetland, were Typha orientalis, which is a native bulrush. I also spotted 2 species of Melaleuca, which are classically Aussie plants. They sometimes go by the name of paper bark, because their bark flakes away like sheets of paper, or occasionally also bottle brushes, because I guess they look like the brushes we all still regularly clean our bottles with. Actually, there's a bit of a debate going on about whether paper barks and bottle brushes should be separate things or considered Melaleuca altogether. Now, I tried to read up on this thrilling botanical back and forth, but got hopelessly lost. And actually, there's over 200 species of Melaleuca out there, and I've no idea for certain what this white variety and this red variety actually are. All I know is they're Mela-looking good. There are 2 common habitats for Melaleuca in Australia. One is in people's garden, where they look very pretty, and the other, more natural habitat, is along waterways. So it's no surprise there's a few species living here in this internationally important wetland. Now here is an unfortunately common sign you'll see in some Australian national parks, and as a European, I can't help but think we've screwed up a bit here. One of our favourite native European species, the red fox, and man's best friend, the dog, are both being poisoned in a wetland on the other side of the world. Why has this happened? Well, the reasons are a bit complex, but basically the fox is a conservation risk because it preys on a lot of native species, especially small mammals. The dogs, on the other hand, when they turn wild, become a danger to domestic livestock. The term wild dog takes in a whole spectrum of Canis lupus, which is the species that all dogs belong to, from wild dingoes all the way through to a stray domestic pet. And in places in Australia where humans have settled, there's often quite a lot of hybridization between these groups of dogs. Poisoning is just one method of controlling these wild canines. There's also trapping, fencing, shooting, and the poison itself, 1080, is highly regulated, but as the sign says, it's just as likely to kill Fido Rex or Rover as it is one of these wild dogs, so best keep pets on leads around here. Oof, that's a lot of dog poisoning chat. So, for something more positive, check out this lovely butterfly. Vaguely familiar? If you're from North America, you will be aware of it from living in North America. But if you're not, you'll probably recognize it from lots of nature documentaries that look at those great big butterfly migrations. This is a monarch butterfly, also known as a wanderer. They were first spotted in Australia in 1871, but didn't really start making a success of it until their caterpillar's favorite food plant, these poisonous plants called milkweeds, started turning up as well. They migrate a bit around Australia, but not nearly as much as they do in North America. But they're still very common and a nice sight. And although they shouldn't really be here, they're actually doing a quite useful job in eating these milkweeds that can, in some cases, become invasive. And they've also slotted quite nicely into the local ecosystem, as this unfortunate specimen caught in a spider's web is proving. It was also a bad day to be this cicada, which made a large, crunchy snack for this Australian magpie. Which brings us on to the birds of Ash Island. Now, as I said, I didn't see as many of the wading birds that I was expecting, but shortly into my walk I came across this marshy little creek, which was full of lots of ducks and other waterfowl. Now, I find ducks very reassuring because no matter where you go in the world, they all look kind of similar. Australia has 20 species of native ducks. I identified 3 here. They're all from this part of the world, and none of them are very threatened. There's the Pacific black duck, which I recognised from the park outside my house. And there was also the chestnut teal and the grey teal, which are very closely related, and it's only very easy to tell the difference if you have 2 daddy ducks, because chestnut teals, unlike grey teals, are sexually dimorphic. Now, in the bird world, sexual dimorphism usually means that the males are just hugely more fabulous than the females, as you can see with this lovely green head on the chestnut duck. Grey teals, both sexes a bit drab. I also spotted some herons. At first I thought it was just one species living here, but then I looked it up later and I realised that one was in fact the white-necked heron and the other was the white-faced heron. What an amateur I am. Hanging out with the ducks and the herons were one of the heron's close relatives, these Australian ibises, and you're actually more likely to see these guys in cities raiding bins than you are stalking for prey in wetlands like this. But my favourite bird by far in this section of the walk was the purple swamp hen, which belonged to a completely different family, the rails, and these things basically just look like souped up moorhens. And family groups of them were strutting around in the reeds. Now, the family structure of swamp hens might perturb a few social conservatives out there. There are usually a lot more males in the group than females, and multiple males will mate with single females. And then they'll lay the egg, and all the males will take turns incubating that egg. And sometimes also the younger swamp hens from a previous brood will also help. It's an interesting setup, and I'm inclined to think this is probably a pretty good deal for the lady swamp hens. Leaving this bird bonanza behind me, I entered the most interesting habitat of this wetland. The trail I was on was called the Rainforest Walk, and I entered a literal rainforest. No, I entered a littoral rainforest. Littoral being the word meaning on the coast. And this is a really rare habitat that occurs in small clumps along the coast in New South Wales. And you notice, as soon as you enter this rainforest, the vegetation changes, the canopy gets thicker, it all gets a bit darker. And I noticed a lot more invertebrates. And by noticed, I mean the flying ones were biting me, and the 8-legged ones were getting webbing all in my face. These orb weaver spiders are related to the spiders that back home, because of my English sentimentality, I associate with those beautiful cobwebs strewn across the hedges on a crisp autumn day. But here, the spiders and the webs are at least twice the size, and you're facing them on the path of a dark rainforest. Literally. But my wonder in the rainforest was only brief. As I say, this type of habitat only exists now in small pockets along the coast, but it being the evening and getting dark, there was a lot of biting and a lot of web in the face, and I'm afraid to say, I quickened my pace. There was just a little bit too much nature in there for me that night. We live in a world where humans and wildlife are coexisting in increasingly weird ways. For example, I saw this large stack of branches right at the top of an electricity pylon. It's probably the nest of a white-bellied sea eagle. Now, these large birds of prey like to find the highest vantage point in a forest to build their nests. Not only does it keep their chicks out of harm's way, it's a really good spot to look for prey. However, the humans have come along and chopped down all the really big trees, so the eagles have started nesting in our own man-made infrastructure, such as pylons. This obviously isn't ideal. It's not safe for the birds. It's annoying for the companies that own the infrastructure because these nests can actually interfere with how they operate. And apparently it's also dangerous for the workers. I was reading an article from Malaysia where eagles have started attacking workers that have tried to remove the nests from the pylons. Can we find a solution? Well, we could try growing back really large trees, but that takes 60 years or more. Perhaps we could build artificial trees in the meantime for the eagles to nest in. But for now, it's another one of those really weird challenges in our Anthropocene age. Anyway, there were no eagles on the pylons today, but you couldn't miss this bird. This is a rosella, and these are some of the most colourful birds you're ever going to find living near humans in Australia. They come in loads of different colour combinations, actually, and what's really fun about them is that depending on what part of Australia you live in, you tend to have a local rosella. So there's a bit of geographical overlap here, but generally, in New South Wales, you'll have these eastern rosellas. But up where I live, in northern Queensland, it's the pale-headed rosella. If you're living in Melbourne, you're most likely to see the crimson rosella. Green rosellas only live in Tasmania. Meanwhile, if you're in the far north of Australia, you're going to see the northern rosella. And if you live in the southwest, around Perth, it's the western rosella. Now, my favourite has to be the pale-headed rosella, because even though I've only been living in North Queensland for 6 months, I've got local pride. But I have to say, I do really appreciate the eastern rosella here, because it looks exactly how 10-year-old me imagined a pirate's parrot should look. On a serious note, one of the threats to rosellas is actually the wild bird trade. I added some other birds to my list, for example this grey fantail, which was flushing insects out of the undergrowth by fanning its tail. And I also got a very blurry photo of this red-browed finch, which I assure you, in focus, looks really cool. The masked lapwings in this part of Australia, also known as spur-winged plovers, seemed a lot more chill than the ones I was used to back in Townsville in Queensland. Perhaps this one just thought it was better to protect its eggs, or the northern variety might just be a lot more psychotic than the lapwings down here. In Queensland, the lapwings would be shouting at me, at the very least, if not dive-bombing me with its spiky wings. As I entered the final leg of my Hunter Wetlands walk, I spotted not one, but two classic Australian wetland birds. The first was this royal spoonbill. Now here's a good word for you, spatulate. And this bird uses its spatulate bill to sweep left and right, sweeping up shrimps and fish and other small aquatic animals. But this design means that it can only feed in water that's quite shallow, about 40 centimetres deep. And that bill has lots of little touch receptors on it called papillae, and it uses these to detect prey in the water, which you'll understand is very useful if, like the spoonbill, you've ever stared into the murky, swirling waters of a marsh and contemplated your own existence and the impending cosmic darkness that is yet to come. Cruising alongside the spoonbill was this Australian pelican. With a wingspan of 3 meters, it is Australia's largest flying bird. And they can often be seen in large groups, driving huge shoals of fish in front of them. However, tonight, Monsieur Pelican was dining alone. So how is it actually feeding here? Well, the pelican's bill is actually very sensitive, and it can use it to detect prey in the murky water. When it finds a promising spot, it plunges its head under, opening its pouch wide like a net, and that pouch is huge. It can hold 13 litres when it's full. But the pouch is also very delicate, so it isn't used to hold prey for any length of time. Instead, the pelican tucks its neck against its chest and lets any water flow out, and it uses its bill to manipulate the prey, which also has a hook on its end to hold on to any particularly slippery morsels. The pelican tips its neck back, and the prey slides into the gullet. And pelicans, well, they have a seafood diet in the sense of the old joke, they see food and they eat it. So mostly they eat fish, but they're more than happy to eat crustaceans or tadpoles or turtles, or when they get desperate, they've been known to drown seagulls and swallow them headfirst. They've also been observed ingeniously using their pouches to collect rainwater to drink. And pelicans are also more than happy to take food from humans. So if you ever find you can't finish your lunch, the Pelican. For any British viewers, the spoonbill and the pelican may seem hopelessly exotic wetland species. But actually, that might not be the case in the near future. After 300 years, spoonbills are now breeding successfully in nature reserves from Yorkshire down to Cambridgeshire. And here's a fun spoonbill fact. At least according to the UK's RSPB, spoonbill chicks are referred to as teaspoons. Meanwhile, Dalmatian pelicans, which are actually a larger species than the Australian pelican, might be making a comeback to Britain fairly soon. There's even a project in Norfolk that's looking into how to reintroduce them. The sun was setting on my adventure in the Hunter Wetlands, but I had imbibed deeply of its natural history, and the next time I think of the Hunter, I shall be thinking of temperate rainforest and pelicans, rather than tempranillo and Pinot Noir.